The mud sucked at Hannah Brennan's boots as she heaved another shovelful through the open doorway, her arms screaming with exhaustion as the cold mountain water continued seeping through the cabin's broken north wall. 3 days of relentless rain had turned Chalk Creek into a monster, and when the water finally receded enough for her to wade back home, she found her small cabin transformed into a swamp of thick Colorado mud that reached halfway up her calves in some places. She had been working since dawn, and the afternoon sun was now slanting through the broken shutters, illuminating the destruction in golden light that felt almost mocking. Everything she owned sat ruined in this muck. The quilts her mother had sewn before the fever took her, the few books she had managed to keep through 2 relocations, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day. All of it was buried somewhere in this mess, and she was alone in trying to salvage what remained of her life. Hannah wiped her forehead with a muddy hand, leaving a streak of grime across her skin. She was 22 years old, and she had never felt so utterly defeated. When she bought this cabin 6 months ago with the money from selling her father's watch, she thought she had finally found stability. Salida, Colorado seemed like a place where a woman alone could make a life for herself. The town was growing, the railroad was coming through, and there were enough respectable jobs for a woman who could read and write. She had been working as a clerk at the general store, saving every penny, dreaming of maybe opening a small school someday. Now those dreams sat buried under several inches of mud and debris. She drove the shovel back into the thick sludge, her back protesting the movement. The water had finally stopped coming in around midday, but the damage was catastrophic. The entire north wall would need to be rebuilt. The floorboards were warped and rotting, and she had no idea how she was going to afford any of it. The $70 she had saved was hidden in a tin can buried behind the cabin. Thank God, but that would barely cover materials, let alone labor. The sound of boots squelching through mud outside made her freeze. Salida was generally safe, but a woman alone was always vulnerable, and she tightened her grip on the shovel handle as a shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat dripping water onto already soaked clothes. He looked like he had been riding through the rain for days. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead beneath his hat, and his blue eyes surveyed the destruction with an expression she could not quite read. "Looks like you could use some help," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Hannah straightened, aware of how she must look, covered head to toe in mud, her blonde hair falling loose from its pins, her dress ruined beyond redemption. "I am managing," she said, lifting her chin even as her arms trembled with fatigue. The man looked at the sea of mud surrounding them, then back at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. He did not say anything, just walked back to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patiently in the rain. He untied a shovel from his saddle pack and returned to the doorway. "What are you doing?" Hannah asked. "Helping," he said simply, and stepped into the cabin, choosing a spot near the far wall and beginning to shovel mud out through one of the broken windows. Hannah stared at him for a long moment. Strangers did not just help for no reason, not in her experience. There was always an expectation, always something they wanted in return. "I cannot pay you," she said firmly. "Did not ask you to," the man replied, not pausing in his work. "Then why?" He stopped then, leaning on his shovel and meeting her eyes directly. "Because you need help, and I have got 2 good arms and a shovel. Does there need to be more reason than that?" She wanted to argue, wanted to send him away, but the truth was she did need help desperately. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and went back to work, and after a moment, so did she. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, the only sounds the sucking of mud against their shovels and the steady drip of water from the leaking roof. Hannah found herself stealing glances at the stranger as they worked. He moved with the easy efficiency of someone used to hard labor, his movements economical and steady. He had to be close to her age, perhaps a year or two older, with a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, and a face that might have been handsome if it was not so weathered and tired. "I am Hannah Brennan," she said finally, feeling the silence grow awkward. "Dawson Grant," he replied, pausing to tip his hat politely before returning to his work. "You are not from Salida," she observed. She knew most of the faces in town by now, at least by sight. "Just passing through," he said. "Was heading north when the creek flooded. Had to wait it out under a rock overhang about 2 miles south of here. Saw the damage when I rode back through." "You saw several damaged cabins, I imagine," Hannah said. "Why stop at mine?" Dawson was quiet for a moment, shoveling another load of mud through the window. "Saw the others had families, men to help. Saw you working alone." Something in her chest tightened at that, a feeling she could not quite name. She ducked her head and went back to work, not trusting herself to speak. They cleared most of the main room before the light began to fail. Hannah's arms felt like lead weights and her back was one continuous ache. When Dawson finally set down his shovel, she nearly wept with relief. "You have got a place to stay tonight?" he asked, looking around the ruined cabin. Hannah hesitated. The truth was she had been sleeping in the lean-to behind the cabin, wrapped in a damp blanket. But admitting that to a stranger felt too vulnerable. "I will be fine," she said. Dawson gave her another one of those long looks that seemed to see right through her polite lies. "The boarding house in town has rooms," he said carefully. "I know," Hannah replied, lifting her chin again. "And I have a perfectly good cabin right here. With no north wall, a leaking roof, and mud still covering half the floor," Dawson pointed out, but his tone was not unkind. "At least let me help you board up that wall before it gets dark. Otherwise you will have every critter in Colorado visiting tonight." She wanted to refuse, but he was right. The gaping hole where the wall had partially collapsed was an invitation to wildlife. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. Dawson retrieved some boards and nails from his saddle pack. The man traveled prepared. She would give him that. They worked together to nail rough planks across the worst of the damage, creating at least a temporary barrier against the elements. As the last nail went in, full darkness had fallen, and Hannah realized she could barely see her hand in front of her face. "I will be back tomorrow morning," Dawson said, gathering his tools. "We can finish clearing the mud and assess what needs rebuilding." "You do not have to do that," Hannah said, but the words lacked conviction. She needed help and they both knew it. "I know I do not have to," Dawson said, "but I am going to anyway. Good night, Miss Brennan." He led his horse away into the darkness before she could respond, leaving her standing in the doorway of her broken cabin, feeling more confused than she had in a long time. Men did not help without wanting something. That had been her experience with the world. Yet Dawson Grant had worked for hours without asking for anything, without making any inappropriate suggestions, without even expecting thanks. She did not know what to make of it. That night, Hannah did sleep in the lean-to, wrapped in her damp blanket with her father's old pistol close at hand. She barely slept, every sound making her start awake, and when the gray light of dawn finally crept across the mountains, she felt more exhausted than she had when she laid down. True to his word, Dawson appeared just after sunrise, leading his horse and carrying a bundle that turned out to be bread, cheese, and jerky. "Figured you might not have had a proper meal recently," he said, offering her the food. Hannah's stomach growled loudly in response, betraying her. She had been rationing her supplies carefully, and she had not eaten anything substantial in 2 days. "I cannot keep accepting your charity," she said, even as her hands reached for the food. "It is not charity," Dawson said. "It is breakfast. And if we are going to work all day, we both need to eat." The logic was sound, and Hannah was too hungry to argue further. They sat on the steps of the cabin, such as they were, and ate in companionable silence. The bread was fresh, probably from the bakery in town, and the cheese was good quality. Hannah tried not to wolf it down, tried to maintain some dignity, but she was so hungry that she finished her portion in minutes. Dawson did not comment, just divided his own portion in half and handed her the rest. "I already ate earlier," he said, which was obviously a lie, but Hannah was too grateful to call him on it. After breakfast, they returned to the mud. In daylight, Hannah could see they had made significant progress the day before, but there was still so much work to be done. They worked steadily through the morning, and as they did, they began to talk. Hannah learned that Dawson was a ranch hand, or had been until 3 weeks ago. He had worked at a spread down near Pueblo, but the owner died and the widow sold the place to a buyer who brought in his own men. Dawson had been on the road since then, looking for work. "Thought I might head up to Wyoming," he said, heaving another shovel of mud out the door. "Heard there are ranches up there hiring for summer hands." "Wyoming is a long way," Hannah observed. "So is everywhere else," Dawson replied with a slight shrug. "When you have got no ties, every place is the same distance." Hannah understood that feeling. After her parents died, she had drifted for nearly a year before settling in Salida. "No family?" she asked, then immediately felt intrusive. "I apologize, that is none of my business." "It is all right," Dawson said. No family. My mother died when I was young, and my father passed about 5 years back. Had a brother, but he went west to California, and I have not heard from him in 3 years." "I am sorry," Hannah said softly. "What about you?" Dawson asked. "You mentioned you cannot pay me, and you are clearly living alone." "No family, not anymore," Hannah said. "My mother died when I was 15, my father 2 years ago. It has been just me since then." They were quiet for a moment, the only sound the scrape of their shovels. There was something oddly comforting about sharing their loneliness with each other, acknowledging the holes in their lives without pity or platitudes. By midday, they had cleared the last of the mud from the main room. The floor was still damp and stained, but at least it was visible. Dawson walked around, testing the floorboards with his weight, and his expression grew more serious. "At least 6 boards need replacing," he said. "And this wall needs to be completely rebuilt properly this time. Whoever built this cabin originally did a shoddy job. The foundation is weak on this side." "Can it be fixed?" Hannah asked, her heart sinking. "It can be," Dawson said. "Going to take time and money, though." Hannah sat down heavily on the one chair that had survived the flood relatively intact. "I have about $70 saved." "Is that enough?" Dawson was quiet for a moment, clearly doing calculations in his head. "For materials, maybe, if we are careful, and I can do most of the labor. But Miss Brennan, I have to be honest with you. This cabin needs more work than just patching the flood damage. The whole structure is unstable. You need a new foundation on this side, new wall supports, a new roof eventually. This flood just revealed problems that were already there." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry, not in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he had been. "Then I will fix what I can afford to fix and hope the rest holds," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "Or," Dawson said carefully, "you could sell the land and move somewhere more secure." "And live where?" Hannah asked, frustration sharpening her tone. "The boarding house. On what money? I spent everything I had to buy this place. This is all I have." Dawson held up his hands in a placating gesture. I was just suggesting. I know it is not that simple. Hannah took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. I apologize. I should not take my frustration out on you. You have been nothing but helpful. You do not need to apologize for being upset about your home being destroyed, Dawson said gently. Anyone would be frustrated. They stood there in the damp cabin, and Hannah felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her like a physical thing. She was alone, nearly broke, and her home was falling apart. She had no family to fall back on, no husband to provide for her, no safety net at all. Let me help you rebuild it properly, Dawson said into the silence. Hannah looked up at him, confused. What? Let me stay and help you rebuild? I can do the work. I grew up helping my father with carpentry. I am not a master builder, but I can frame a wall and lay a foundation well enough. I told you, I cannot pay you, Hannah said. I know, Dawson replied, but you could feed me while I work and I can sleep in that lean-to out back. I was heading to Wyoming looking for work that might not even be there. At least here, I would be doing something useful. Hannah stared at him, trying to understand his angle, trying to figure out what he really wanted. But his blue eyes were direct and honest, and she could detect no deception in his face. Why would you do this? She asked. You do not even know me. Dawson was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. My mother died alone when I was 12. I was working in the fields with my father, and she had some kind of attack, maybe her heart. The doctor was not sure. If someone had been there, maybe they could have helped her, or at least gotten the doctor faster. But she was alone, and by the time we found her, it was too late. He paused, meeting Hannah's eyes. I guess I do not like seeing people struggle alone when I could help. Maybe it does not make sense, but there it is. Hannah felt her throat tighten with emotion. It makes sense, she whispered. So will you let me help? Dawson asked. Every practical instinct Hannah had screamed that this was improper, that letting a strange man stay on her property would ruin her reputation, that she should refuse on principle. But the alternative was losing her home, possibly losing everything, and she was so tired of being alone and struggling. Yes, she said finally. Yes, you can stay and help, but I insist on feeding you properly, and you will sleep in the lean-to with proper blankets, not just hay. Dawson's face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his weathered features into something genuinely handsome. It is a deal, Miss Brennan. If you are going to be staying here, you should call me Hannah, she said. Hannah, he repeated, as if testing the name. Then you should call me Dawson. They shook hands on it, a formal little gesture that felt oddly significant, and Hannah felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since the flood, she felt a flicker of hope. The next week passed in a blur of hard work. Dawson proved to be as skilled as he claimed, and they fell into an easy routine. They rose with the sun and worked until the light failed, breaking only for meals and the occasional rest when the heat grew too oppressive. Hannah cooked what she could with her limited supplies, and Dawson contributed money from his own meager savings to buy additional food and materials from town. The first time they went to town together to purchase lumber, Hannah felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. Salida was a small enough town that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a single woman living alone with a strange man was the kind of scandal that set tongues wagging. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, stopped them on the street with a look of pointed concern. Hannah, dear, I heard you had some damage from the flood. Is this man bothering you? No, Mrs. Patterson, Hannah said firmly. This is Dawson Grant. He is helping me repair my cabin. Mrs. Patterson looked Dawson up and down with clear suspicion. Is he staying on your property? Hannah felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. He is working in exchange for meals. The flood damage was extensive. I am sleeping in the lean-to, madam, Dawson added politely, removing his hat. Everything is perfectly proper, Mrs. Patterson sniffed. I am sure. You know what people will say, Hannah. People will say what they want regardless of the truth, Hannah replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I need my cabin repaired and Dawson is helping me. If people want to make something improper out of basic human kindness, that says more about them than about us. Mrs. Patterson looked taken aback, but she recovered quickly. Well, I am just concerned for your reputation, dear. I appreciate your concern, Hannah said, in a tone that made it clear she did not appreciate it at all. As they walked away, Dawson glanced at her with a mixture of amusement and concern. I did not think about how this might affect your standing in town, he said quietly. If you want me to leave, I understand. Do you want to leave? Hannah asked. No, Dawson said honestly, but I do not want to cause problems for you either. Hannah thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. I have spent my whole life worrying about what people think, trying to be respectable and proper. And where has it gotten me? Alone and struggling. If people want to gossip, let them. At least I will have a roof over my head that does not leak. Dawson smiled at that, and they continued to the lumber yard. As the days passed, Hannah found herself looking forward to their time together. Dawson was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh when she least expected it. He told her stories about his time working ranches, about ornery cattle and stubborn horses, about cowboys who could not cook to save their lives, and one memorable incident involving a skunk and the bunkhouse. In turn, Hannah told him about her childhood, about her mother's love of books and how she used to read to Hannah every night, about her father's quiet strength, and how much she missed him. She told him about her dream of opening a school, of teaching children to read and giving them opportunities she never had. You would be a good teacher, Dawson said one evening as they sat on the front steps, eating a simple supper of beans and cornbread. You are patient and kind, and you explain things clearly. How would you know that? Hannah asked, amused. You taught me how to make cornbread this week, Dawson pointed out. I have been trying to make decent cornbread for years, and it always came out like rocks. Yours is perfect, and now I can make it too because you showed me the right way. Hannah felt a warm glow at the compliment. That is hardly the same as teaching children to read. The principle is the same, Dawson said. You have got the gift for it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was finally cooling after another hot day. Can I ask you something personal? Hannah said. Of course, Dawson replied. Why have you never married? You are a good man, hardworking, kind. Surely women have been interested. Dawson was quiet for so long that Hannah thought she had overstepped, but finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful. I guess I never found the right person. I have moved around so much, working different ranches, never staying in one place long enough to really build something with someone. And I have seen enough bad marriages to know that marrying just for the sake of being married is worse than being alone. That is very wise, Hannah said. What about you? Dawson asked. You are beautiful and smart and capable. Why are you alone? Hannah felt her cheeks heat at being called beautiful. My father was sick for a long time before he died. I took care of him, and there was not exactly time for courtship. And after he passed, I was too busy trying to survive to think about romance. Also, most men seem to want a woman who will agree with everything they say and never have an opinion of her own. I have never been very good at that, Dawson laughed. No, I imagine you have not been. Any man worth having would not want that anyway. Do you really believe that? Hannah asked. I do, Dawson said seriously. What would be the point of spending your life with someone who never challenged you, never made you think, never had their own ideas? That sounds boring as hell, pardon my language. Hannah smiled. No pardon necessary. I agree completely. Their eyes met, and Hannah felt something pass between them, something warm and electric that made her heart beat faster. She looked away first, suddenly flustered, and stood up quickly. I should clean up from supper, she said, gathering the dishes with hands that trembled slightly. Let me help, Dawson said, standing as well. They washed the dishes together in the basin outside, their hands occasionally brushing against each other in the soapy water, each touch sending little sparks through Hannah's skin. She was intensely aware of his presence beside her, of the breadth of his shoulders and the quiet strength in his movements. This was dangerous, she thought. She was falling for him, and that was the last thing she should be doing. He was a drifter, a man passing through, and once her cabin was fixed he would be gone, heading north to Wyoming or wherever the work took him. Getting attached would only lead to heartbreak, but even as she thought it, she knew it was too late. She was already attached. By the end of the second week, the cabin was transformed. The north wall was completely rebuilt, stronger than it had been before. The damaged floorboards were replaced, and Dawson had even reinforced the foundation on that side of the structure. The roof was patched, and he had built proper shutters for the windows to replace the broken ones. Hannah stood in the doorway, looking at the result of their work, and felt tears prick her eyes. It was beautiful. It was better than it had been when she bought it. Her home was whole again. "What do you think?" Dawson asked, coming to stand beside her. "I think it is perfect," Hannah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I cannot thank you enough for what you have done." "You do not need to thank me," Dawson said. "You fed me well and gave me a place to stay. It was a fair trade." But they both knew it was not a fair trade. What Dawson had done was worth far more than a few meals and a spot in a lean-to. He had given her back her home, her security, her hope. "What will you do now?" Hannah asked quietly, not looking at him. Dawson was silent for a long moment. "I suppose I should move on, head north like I planned." "Yes," Hannah said, her heart sinking. "I suppose you should." Another long silence. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the newly repaired cabin. "Unless," Dawson said slowly. "Unless what?" Hannah asked, finally looking at him. "Unless you wanted me to stay," Dawson said, meeting her eyes. "There is a ranch about 10 miles east of here. I heard in town they are hiring hands for the summer cattle drive. The pay is decent. I could take the job, stay in the area." Hannah's heart leaped, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why would you do that?" Dawson took a step closer to her. "I think you know why, Hannah." She did know, had known for days now, but hearing him say it was different. "Tell me anyway," she whispered. "Because somewhere between shoveling mud and rebuilding walls, I fell in love with you," Dawson said simply. "I know it is fast. I know it does not make practical sense, but there it is. I love you, Hannah Brennan. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you never give up even when everything is falling apart. I love the way you laugh at my stupid jokes, and the way you get this little crease between your eyebrows when you are concentrating. I love everything about you, and I do not want to leave." Hannah felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "I have been trying not to because I thought you would leave, but I do. I love you so much it terrifies me." Dawson reached out and cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Then I will stay," he said. "If you will have me, I will stay." "Yes," Hannah said. "Yes, please stay." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Hannah felt like she was coming home. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and she melted into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished for the first time in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably do this properly," he said. "Hannah Brennan, will you marry me?" Hannah laughed, a sound of pure joy. "That was the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." "It is the only proposal you have ever heard," Dawson pointed out. "True," Hannah admitted. "And yes, yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, longer this time, and Hannah felt happiness bubble up inside her like champagne. Against all odds, against every expectation, she had found love in the ruins of a flood. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Dawson took the job at the ranch, riding out before dawn each day and returning in the evening, tired but content. Hannah continued her work at the general store, and together, they saved money for their future. They were married on a bright Saturday morning in late June by the circuit preacher who came through Salida once a month. It was a small ceremony, just a handful of people from town who had come to accept Dawson's presence and Hannah's happiness. Mrs. Patterson even attended, though she sniffed disapprovingly through the whole service. Hannah wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Dawson wore his cleanest shirt and a new vest he had purchased for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Dawson kissed her with such tenderness that Hannah felt her heart might burst. They had a small celebration at the cabin afterward, with cake and coffee and the well wishes of their few friends. As the sun set and the guests departed, Hannah and Dawson stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the sky turn gold and pink. "Happy?" Dawson asked, his arm around her waist. "Deliriously," Hannah replied, leaning into him. "I never thought I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Dawson admitted. "When I rode up and saw you shoveling that mud alone, I never imagined it would lead to this." "I am glad you stopped," Hannah said. "I am glad you grabbed a shovel and stayed." "Me too," Dawson said and kissed the top of her head. That night, as they lay together in the cabin that had brought them together, Hannah felt a sense of peace and rightness that she had never experienced before. This was where she belonged, in this place, with this man. Everything she had been through, all the loss and struggle and loneliness, had led her here, and it had been worth it. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dawson worked at the ranch during the day, and Hannah continued at the general store. In the evenings they would cook together, tend the small garden they had started, and talk about their dreams for the future. On Sundays, they would ride into town for church, and afterward they would walk along Chalk Creek, which had returned to its peaceful meandering now that the rains had stopped. Hannah discovered that marriage to Dawson was nothing like she had feared. He did not try to control her or diminish her opinions. He listened when she spoke, valued her thoughts, and made decisions with her rather than for her. They argued sometimes, usually about small things like whether they could afford a new stove or how much to spend on supplies, but they always talked through their disagreements until they reached a compromise. In August, Hannah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been certain until she missed her second monthly course. She waited until evening, until they had finished supper and were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, before she told Dawson. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding. Dawson looked at her, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," Hannah said quickly. "At least, I do not think so. I am pregnant." For a moment Dawson just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a fool. "Really? You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor," Hannah said. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Dawson laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Hannah, I am more than happy. I am ecstatic. We are going to have a baby." He kissed her thoroughly, and Hannah felt relief and joy wash over her. She had not been sure how he would react. They had not discussed children, and money was still tight. But Dawson was clearly thrilled and his excitement was contagious. "We need to get the doctor to confirm," Dawson said, already planning. "And we will need to prepare a space for the baby. We can partition off a corner of the cabin for a nursery, and you should probably stop working at the store as you get further along. I can pick up extra work at the ranch." "Dawson," Hannah said, laughing, "slow down. We have time. I am only about 2 months along." But Dawson was not to be slowed down. Over the next few days he threw himself into preparations with the same dedication he had shown rebuilding the cabin. He built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, carving little stars and moons into the headboard. He reinforced the cabin walls further and added extra insulation for winter. He even built a larger bed for them, saying they would need more room once the baby arrived. Hannah watched him work with a mixture of amusement and love. This man who had been a stranger just a few months ago was now her husband, the father of her child, and she could not imagine her life without him. As fall arrived and her belly began to swell with the growing baby, Hannah continued working at the general store, despite Dawson's concerns. She enjoyed the work, enjoyed feeling useful and contributing to their savings. Mr. Henderson, who owned the store, was understanding and let her sit when she needed to rest. In October, disaster struck again, though of a different kind. The ranch where Dawson worked lost half its herd to rustlers, and the owner had to let several hands go to save money. Dawson was one of them. He came home that evening looking defeated, and Hannah felt her heart sink as he told her the news. "We will be all right," she said, trying to sound confident. "We have some savings and I am still working. We can manage until you find something else." "You should not have to be working at all in your condition," Dawson said, frustration evident in his voice. "And jobs are scarce right now. Half the men in town are looking for work." They sat together on the porch, both worried but trying not to show it. Hannah took his hand and squeezed it. "We will figure it out," she said. "We always do." And they did. Dawson took odd jobs around town doing carpentry work, hauling supplies, anything that paid. It was not steady work and the money was unpredictable, but they managed. Hannah worked at the store until she was 7 months pregnant, when Mr. Henderson finally insisted she stay home and rest. Money was tight that winter, tighter than it had been even when Hannah was alone. But somehow they made it work. They ate simple meals, burned less firewood by huddling together under blankets, and counted every penny. But they never went hungry, and the cabin stayed warm enough. More importantly, they had each other. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, they would lie together in bed, Dawson's hand on Hannah's swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and move. "What should we name it?" Dawson asked one night. "If it is a girl, I want to name her Sarah after my mother," Hannah said. "What about if it is a boy?" Dawson was quiet for a moment. "My father's name was James. I always liked that name." "James Grant," Hannah said, testing it out. "I like it. James if it is a boy, Sarah if it is a girl." "What if we have twins?" Dawson asked, his eyes twinkling. "Then we will use both names and figure out a third," Hannah replied, laughing. "I am just happy it is only one," Dawson said, kissing her forehead. "I do not think my heart could take the worry of two." He worried constantly as Hannah's due date approached. Every twinge, every complaint, every sign of discomfort sent him into a panic. Hannah found it both endearing and exasperating. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him when he insisted on riding into town to fetch the doctor because she had mentioned her back was sore. "I am not going to break." "I know," Dawson said, "but you are precious to me and so is this baby." "I cannot help worrying." Hannah softened at that, reaching up to cup his cheek. "I know, and I love you for it, but I am strong and I am healthy and everything will be fine." She said it with more confidence than she felt. The truth was she was scared too. Her own mother had died of fever, not childbirth, but Hannah knew the dangers. Women died giving birth all the time and babies died even more often. But showing fear would only make Dawson's anxiety worse, so she kept her worries to herself and projected calm assurance. The baby came in early March, 2 weeks before Hannah's due date. Her water broke in the middle of the night, waking her with a gush of fluid and the first contractions. She woke Dawson, who immediately flew into action, riding through the darkness to fetch Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Henderson, who served as the town midwife. Hannah labored through the night and into the morning, with Mrs. Henderson coaching her and Dr. Morrison standing by in case of complications. Dawson was relegated to the other side of a curtain they had hung for privacy, but Hannah could hear him pacing, could sense his anxiety even through the fabric barrier. The pain was worse than anything Hannah had imagined, wave after wave of agony that made her cry out despite her determination to stay quiet. But Mrs. Henderson was calm and encouraging, telling her she was doing wonderfully, that the baby was coming along just fine. As the sun rose, painting the cabin in soft golden light, Hannah gave one final push and felt a sudden release. A moment later, a sharp, indignant cry filled the air. "It is a boy," Dr. Morrison announced, and Hannah heard Dawson's whoop of joy from the other side of the curtain. Mrs. Henderson cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Hannah's arms. Hannah looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and shock of dark hair, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "Hello, James," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world." The curtain was pulled back and Dawson rushed in, his eyes wide and wet with tears. "Can I?" he asked, reaching for the baby. Hannah carefully transferred their son into Dawson's arms, watching as this strong, capable man turned to complete mush at the sight of his child. "He is perfect," Dawson said, his voice choked with emotion. "He is absolutely perfect. Hannah, we made this. We made this perfect little person." "We did," Hannah agreed, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Dr. Morrison pronounced both mother and baby healthy, and after giving instructions for care, he and Mrs. Henderson left. Dawson climbed into bed next to Hannah, carefully holding James, and the three of them lay there together as the morning light grew brighter. "I love you," Dawson said, looking at Hannah with such tenderness it took her breath away. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for him, for us, for everything." "I love you too," Hannah replied. "Thank you for stopping that day, for helping me, for staying." "I will always stay," Dawson promised. "Nothing could make me leave you now." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still required constant attention. Hannah was grateful that Dawson was home, picking up odd jobs here and there but mostly able to help with the baby. They took turns walking James when he cried, changing his diapers, marveling at every new sound and expression. Dawson proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle, singing to James in a low, rumbling voice that always seemed to soothe the baby. As spring turned to summer, Dawson's carpentry work picked up. Word had spread about his skill, and people in Salida and the surrounding area began seeking him out for projects. He built furniture, repaired barns, even constructed a small addition onto the church. The money was good, better than what he had made as a ranch hand, and it was more consistent. "Maybe I should open a proper carpentry business," Dawson said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching James sleep in his cradle. "I could build a workshop, take on apprentices eventually." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Hannah said. You are talented and there is clearly demand for your work." Dawson looked at her, his expression serious. "It would mean staying in Salida permanently. No more drifting, no more following work to different towns." "Is that what you want, Dawson?" Hannah said, taking his hand. "This is my home." "You are my home. I have never wanted anything more than to stay right here with you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Hannah felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. This was her life now. A home she loved, work that mattered, a husband who adored her, a beautiful son. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. Over the next year, Dawson's carpentry business grew steadily. He built a workshop behind the cabin and began taking on larger projects. Hannah helped with the business side, keeping the books and managing orders, work she could do while caring for James. When James was a year old, Hannah started teaching reading and arithmetic to a few of the children in town whose parents could afford to pay for lessons. It was not the school she had dreamed of, but it was a start and she loved it. Dawson built her a small desk and shelves for books, creating a dedicated space in the cabin for teaching. Life was good. Not easy, certainly. Money was still sometimes tight and there were always challenges. But they faced everything together as a team, and that made all the difference. When James was 2 years old, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. The news was both exciting and terrifying. They had barely adjusted to one child, and now there would be 2. But Dawson was thrilled and his joy was infectious. "Maybe this time it will be a girl," he said, his hand on Hannah's still flat stomach. "A little sister for James." "Or another boy," Hannah pointed out. "We cannot predict these things." "Either way," Dawson said, "our family is growing, and that is a blessing." This pregnancy was harder than the first. Hannah was exhausted all the time, struggling to care for an energetic toddler while her body was occupied growing another human. Dawson took on more of the household work, cooking and cleaning in addition to his carpentry business. In November, Hannah gave birth to a daughter. The labor was faster this time, only 6 hours from start to finish, and when Dr. Morrison placed the baby in Hannah's arms, she looked down at a tiny face that was the image of her own mother. "Sarah," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Her name is Sarah." Dawson, holding James and keeping him from climbing on the bed, looked at his daughter with the same awestruck expression he had worn when James was born. "She is beautiful," he said. "She looks just like you." "She looks like my mother," Hannah corrected gently. "Then she looks like you," Dawson repeated, "because you have your mother's face in the photograph." Hannah supposed that was true. She had been told her whole life that she resembled her mother, though she had trouble seeing it herself. With 2 children, life became even more chaotic. James was going through a phase of testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before getting in trouble. Sarah was a fussy baby, crying often and sleeping irregularly. Hannah and Dawson stumbled through those early months in a haze of exhaustion, taking turns getting up with the baby at night, trying to keep James entertained and out of trouble during the day. But there were beautiful moments, too. The first time James held his sister and looked at her with such tenderness that Hannah cried. The way Dawson could juggle both children, holding Sarah while playing with James, making them both laugh. The quiet evenings when the children were finally asleep, and Hannah and Dawson could sit together, too tired to talk but finding comfort in simple proximity. As the years passed, the family settled into a rhythm. Dawson's carpentry business became one of the most respected in the area, and they were finally financially secure. Hannah's teaching expanded, and she eventually opened a small school in a building Dawson constructed for her. It was only 1 room, and she only had about a dozen students, but it was hers, and she loved it. James grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved helping his father in the workshop. Sarah was spirited and curious, always asking questions and getting into everything. They were both healthy and happy, and Hannah thanked God every day for the blessing of her family. When James was 6 and Sarah was 4, Hannah found herself pregnant once more. This pregnancy was completely unexpected. She and Dawson had assumed they were done having children, and the news came as a shock. "I am too old for this," Hannah said, at 30 years old, feeling ancient compared to when she had James. "You are not too old," Dawson assured her, "and we will manage just like we always do." This time, Hannah gave birth to another boy. The labor was long and difficult, and Dr. Morrison was concerned for a while, but in the end, both mother and baby came through healthy. They named him Daniel, and he completed their family. Life with 3 children was wonderfully chaotic. The cabin that had once seemed too big for just Hannah now felt cramped with 5 people. So Dawson built an addition, adding 2 more rooms and expanding the living area. The children filled the house with noise and laughter, and though Hannah was constantly busy and often tired, she could not imagine it any other way. As the children grew, they became more independent, and Hannah and Dawson found they had more time for each other again. They would take walks in the evening after the children were in bed, talking about everything and nothing, still finding new things to discover about each other even after years of marriage. "You ever regret it?" Hannah asked one evening as they walked along Chalk Creek, the same creek that had flooded so many years ago. "Stopping that day, helping me, staying in Salida." Dawson stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Not for one single second," he said. "That day changed my life. I was drifting, going nowhere, and then I found you. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. How could I ever regret that?" Hannah reached up and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. "I love you," she said. "I love our life together." "I love you too," Dawson replied. "Always have, always will." The years continued to pass. James grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with Hannah's intelligence and love of learning. He decided to become a teacher like his mother, attending the normal school in Denver and returning to Salida to teach alongside Hannah in the school. Sarah grew into a beautiful, independent young woman who had no interest in traditional feminine pursuits. She loved working with her father in the carpentry shop and proved to have a natural talent for building. Dawson taught her everything he knew, and together they expanded the business even further. Daniel, the youngest, turned out to be the most like his father. Quiet and steady, with a deep sense of integrity and a willingness to help anyone who needed it. He worked odd jobs around town, still too young to settle on a career, but already respected for his good character. Hannah and Dawson watched their children grow with pride and a little sadness. The years had gone by so quickly. The children who had once been babies now adults with lives of their own. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dawson surprised Hannah with a gift. He led her outside to where a beautiful 2-seat wagon waited, hitched to a fine pair of horses. "What is this?" Hannah asked, laughing. "Our anniversary present," Dawson said. "I thought we could take a trip, just the 2 of us. The children are old enough to manage without us for a few days. We could go to Denver, see the sights, stay in a fancy hotel." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. In 20 years of marriage, they had never taken a trip together, never had a moment that was just for them. There had always been too much work, too many responsibilities. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you want," Dawson said, grinning. "I already arranged everything." The trip to Denver was magical. They stayed in a beautiful hotel, ate in fine restaurants, and walked the city streets hand in hand like young sweethearts. They talked for hours, remembering their early days together, marveling at how far they had come. On their last night in Denver, as they lay in the hotel bed, Dawson pulled Hannah close. "I meant what I said all those years ago," he said, "about falling in love with you while we were shoveling mud and rebuilding walls. Best decision I ever made was to stop that day." "Best thing that ever happened to me was you stopping," Hannah replied. "I was so alone, so scared. And then you appeared and changed everything." "We changed everything together," Dawson corrected. "You are the strongest person I know, Hannah. You would have survived without me." "Maybe," Hannah said, "but I would not have thrived. You gave me more than help with a flooded cabin. You gave me a partner, a family, a life full of love. That is a gift beyond measure." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never faded, even after 20 years. And as Hannah fell asleep in Dawson's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. A flood that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning. If Chalk Creek had not overflowed its banks, if her cabin had not been destroyed, if Dawson had not ridden by at exactly that moment and decided to stop and help, her life would have been completely different. She would have struggled alone, probably lost the cabin eventually, maybe been forced to leave Salida entirely. She would have survived, she supposed, but she would have been alone. No husband, no children, no beautiful life full of love and purpose. Instead, she had everything. And it all started with a flooded cabin and a cowboy who grabbed a shovel and stayed. They returned to Salida refreshed and happy, ready to rejoin their family. The children had managed well in their absence. The house was still standing, and nothing had burned down, which Sarah joked was a minor miracle. Life continued on. James married a sweet schoolteacher from Colorado Springs and brought her to Salida, where they built a house near Hannah and Dawson. Sarah showed no interest in marriage, preferring to focus on the carpentry business, which she eventually took over from Dawson as he got older. Daniel fell in love with the daughter of a rancher and went to work on her father's spread, finally finding his calling. Hannah and Dawson became grandparents, delighting in spoiling James's children and watching the next generation grow. They were still healthy and active well into their 50s, though Dawson's hands sometimes ached from decades of carpentry work, and Hannah's eyes were not as sharp as they once were, but they were happy. They had built a good life together, raised good children, and contributed to their community in meaningful ways. Hannah's school had educated hundreds of children over the years, and Dawson's carpentry work had literally built much of the town. On warm summer evenings, they would still sit on the porch of the cabin, now expanded and improved but still fundamentally the same structure where their story began. They would watch the sunset and talk about the old days, about the flood and the mud and that first moment when Dawson grabbed a shovel and decided to stay. "No regrets?" Hannah would ask, the question now a comfortable ritual. "Not a single one," Dawson would always reply and kiss her hand. As they grew older, they slowed down but never stopped. Hannah continued teaching as long as her health allowed, and Dawson kept working in the shop, creating beautiful pieces even when his hands protested. They had earned their rest, but neither of them was interested in sitting idle. When Hannah was 60, she finally retired from teaching, passing the school to James, who had proven to be an excellent educator. At 62, Dawson officially handed the carpentry business to Sarah, though he still spent hours in the workshop, teaching Daniel's oldest son the trade. They had more time together then, and they used it well. They took walks, visited with their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoyed each other's company. After 40 years of marriage, they could communicate with a glance, finish each other's sentences, and move around each other with the synchronized ease of a well-practiced dance. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration. The whole town came, it seemed, filling their yard with laughter and music and love. Hannah stood with Dawson, looking at the crowd of people whose lives they had touched, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "We did good," Dawson said, his arm around her waist. "We did," Hannah agreed. "We did very good." That night, after everyone had left and they were alone again, they sat on the porch watching the stars. Hannah leaned against Dawson, feeling the solid warmth of him, and thought about the scared, lonely woman she had been 40 years ago, shoveling mud from a flooded cabin with no idea how she would survive. She could go back and tell that woman what the future held. She would not believe it. The love, the family, the joy, the beautiful, messy, wonderful life that would unfold from that one terrible day when the creek flooded and destroyed everything she owned. "What are you thinking about?" Dawson asked, sensing the direction of her thoughts the way he always did. "I am thinking about floods," Hannah said, "and cowboys who stop to help, and how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things in our lives." "Profound," Dawson said, but his voice was gentle, not teasing. "It is true, though," Hannah insisted. "If the cabin had not flooded, if you had not stopped, we would never have met. All of this, everything we built together, started because of a disaster." "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Dawson said. "Maybe not in the exact same way, but somehow." "You are a romantic," Hannah said, smiling. "Always have been," Dawson replied, "at least where you are concerned." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Dawson spoke again. "You know what I remember most about that first day?" "What?" Hannah asked. "How stubborn you were," Dawson said, laughing. "Standing there covered in mud, exhausted, clearly overwhelmed, but still insisting you could manage alone. I knew right then you were special. Anyone else would have broken down, would have given up, but not you. You just kept shoveling." "I did not feel brave," Hannah admitted. "I felt terrified." "Bravery is not the absence of fear," Dawson said. "It is moving forward despite the fear. You have always been the bravest person I know." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, as they often did these days. Getting older made her emotional, made her appreciate every moment because she knew there were fewer of them ahead than behind. "I love you," she said, turning to face him. "I have loved you for 40 years, and I will love you for however many more we have." "I love you too," Dawson replied and kissed her softly. "Forever and always." They lived many more years together, watching their grandchildren grow and welcoming great-grandchildren. They saw the 20th century arrive, bringing changes they could never have imagined. Automobiles started appearing in Salida, replacing horses and wagons. Electric lights replaced oil lamps. The world was transforming, but their love remained constant. Dawson passed away peacefully in his sleep when he was 78 years old, with Hannah beside him. His heart simply stopped, the doctor said, worn out after a long life of hard work and deep feeling. Hannah held his hand and told him she loved him one last time, and though her heart shattered into a million pieces, she was grateful he went peacefully, without pain or suffering. She lived 2 more years after Dawson died, years filled with the love of her children and grandchildren, but empty of the partnership that had defined her adult life. She missed him every moment of every day, but she did not waste her grief. She continued teaching occasionally, spent time with family, and made sure to tell anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had stopped to help her shovel mud from a flooded cabin and ended up staying for a lifetime. When Hannah died at 80 years old, surrounded by 3 generations of family who loved her, her last thoughts were of Dawson. She could almost see him waiting for her, shovel in hand, ready to help her with whatever came next. And she smiled, knowing that their story was not really over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one without pain or separation, where they could be together again forever. They were buried side by side in the Salada cemetery, under a large oak tree. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription that their children had chosen together: Hannah and Dawson Grant. They built a life from mud and love. And in the years that followed, their children and grandchildren would gather at the cabin, now maintained as a family landmark, and tell the story of how it all began. About a flood and a cowboy and a woman who would not give up. About love found in the ruins of disaster. About a partnership that lasted a lifetime and built something beautiful from nothing. The cabin still stood, generation after generation, a testament to what Dawson and Hannah had built together. And when the newest members of the family asked why they kept the old place instead of tearing it down and building something modern, the answer was always the same: because this was where it started. This was where a woman was shoveling mud from a flooded cabin alone, and a cowboy grabbed a shovel and stayed. This was where two lonely people found each other and built a family, a legacy, a love that would echo through time. This was where their story began, and in many ways it would never end. Because the love Dawson and Hannah shared lived on in their descendants, in the lessons they taught, in the community they built, in the example they set of what marriage and partnership could be. And so the cabin remained, a monument to one simple truth that Hannah and Dawson had learned together all those years ago. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best moments. Sometimes disaster is just opportunity in disguise. And sometimes, when everything falls apart, it is just making room for something better to be built in its place. All you need is the courage to keep going, to keep shoveling through the mud, and maybe, if you are very lucky, someone will come along, grab a shovel, and stay.